Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer, and today is the third and final part of our little mini video series on Form 22B, the Home Sale Contingency Addendum. And in the first two videos, we talked about how to use the form. But in this video, I want to discuss with you three questions that routinely come up with the use of Form 22B. First question I want to talk about is, here's how the question goes. So when in this process do we add a Form 22Q? 22Q is the Pending Sale Contingency Addendum, and the answer is never. Never, ever, ever. If you have a transaction that includes a Form 22B, you never, ever include a Form 22Q. Where people get confused is that the Form 22B is the home sale contingency. Form 22Q is the pending sale contingency. So in some brokers' minds, it makes sense that once the buyer sells their home and they have a pending sale, that they would need to add in the Form 22Q. Wrong. And if you do that, you are going to create a transaction that has an internal inconsistency. For example, Form 22B sets the closing date based on the terms of the Form 22B. When Form 22B is in a transaction, Form 22B controls the closing date of the transaction. If buyer's property sells, then the closing date of seller's property will always be exactly 3 days following the date of the closing of buyer's property. If buyer's property doesn't sell and buyer waives, then the closing date of seller's transaction will always be 30 days after the date of waiver. Form 22Q, however, has a closing date provision that says whatever the date of closing on the face of Form 21 is the closing date. If you add a Form 22Q into a transaction where you already have a Form 22B, you have conflicting and inconsistent provisions regarding the closing date of the transaction. You cannot do that. Bright line rule, never to be violated. If there's a 22B in your transaction, never, ever inject a 22Q into that transaction. Second issue. Buyer brokers will often ask me, why can't we, with respect to the 22B, modify the terms to say that if buyer waives the home sale contingency, buyer doesn't waive all their other contingencies. In other words, buyer can waive the home sale contingency and still retain the benefit of what other contingencies might be out there, the financing contingency, the inspection contingency, whatever else survives at this point. The answer is, well, you could do that. You could modify the terms of the agreement to say that. You can modify the terms of the agreement to say anything at all. But listing brokers don't let a seller agree to that. Why not? Because the industry standard is established by the boilerplate of this language. the boilerplate language of this form. And the industry standard says that when a buyer comes to a seller and says to the seller, hey, I've got to sell my property before I can buy your property. So let's, seller, agree that we're going to hamper your ability to attract other buyers by shackling your property with my home sale contingent offer. When a buyer comes to a seller and says that, and then some number of days later says, just kidding, not really. I really can waive my home sale contingency. I really could buy your property even without selling my own. And yeah, I know you've got a second buyer, and the second buyer might be really well qualified, ready to go buyer, but still, I'm going to require you to send that other second buyer packing so that you can sell to me. Even though I kind of told you maybe an untruth to start with. If a buyer is going to put the seller in that position, it can't be without consequence. So if a buyer is going to force a seller to send away a second buyer whose offer seller has already accepted, then the buyer who does that had better be ready to close the transaction. Which leads to the third question. When should a buyer's broker use a Form 22B, and when should they not? Let's go all the way back to the time buyer broker, when you're writing buyer's offer. And buyer says to you, I want to buy seller's property, but I have this other piece of property that I have to sell first. Buyer broker, you ask two very probing questions. And you ask these probing questions. You don't assume anything. You ask these questions and you demand an answer. First question, buyer, what do you mean by you have to sell this other property? Does that mean you literally have to sell this other property before you can buy seller's property? Or does it mean that you prefer to sell this other property before you buy seller's property? Here's the difference, buyer. Have to sell means that you cannot close the purchase of seller's property unless and until you have sold and closed your own property. Prefer means that you could go out and get a bridge loan, or you could utilize other resources, or you could find some pot of money to use to buy seller's property if you had to, but you'd really rather sell this other property and use that money to buy seller's property. That's the difference between have to and prefer to. Buyer, which is it? And if the answer from buyer is, I have to sell my property before I can buy seller's property, then pull out your Form 22B and proceed. Because that buyer is never, ever, ever going to be in a position where they waive the home sale contingency, thereby creating a waiver of all their other contingencies and requiring closing within 30 days. Why is buyer never going to be in that position? Because this buyer has just told you that there's no way they could close the transaction for the purchase of seller's property unless they first sold their property. So they are never going to waive the home sale contingency. Pull out your Form 22B, fill it out, go and try and get buyer's offer accepted. If, however, the buyer says, okay, I don't really have to sell my property, but I prefer to sell my property, then the next question, question number 2, again, you got to demand an answer to this question. Okay, buyer, understanding that, let's fast forward in our imaginations to a time when you are confronted by the seller giving you a bump notice, telling you that you either have to go away or waive your home sale contingency and purchase the property without selling your property. If buyer, you are confronted with that question, what will your choice be? And if the buyer's answer is that the buyer will waive their home sale contingency and proceed to purchase seller's property without first selling their own property, then buyer broker, set your 22B aside and help buyer create terms of the transaction that give buyer sufficient time before closing to try to market their property, sufficient time before closing to get a bridge loan if necessary, sufficient time to do all of the contingency work that they really need to do. In that situation, maybe you can negotiate a slightly longer closing date. Maybe, especially in a good seller's market, your buyer has time to sell their property anyway. You must exercise full disclosure with the seller. If your buyer is going to use a Form 22A financing contingency and the buyer has to get a bridge loan, you're going to disclose that to seller. Buyer brokers, you need to be honest in your presentation of buyer's offer as to what's going on in this transaction. But if buyer can purchase seller's property without first selling buyer's property, then don't include a Form 22B with the transaction. Instead, try to create parameters for the transaction that allow your buyer the opportunity to sell if they can, get a bridge loan if they can't, close the purchase of seller's property without ever confronting the risk of having to waive all of buyer's other contingencies. Here's what I do not want you to take away from this video. Do not ever believe that what I just said is that if buyer has to sell their property before they can buy seller's property, that you are going to not use a 22B in the transaction, because that's not what I said. If buyer has to sell buyer's property before buyer can complete the purchase of seller's property, then you must use a Form 22B. That's the form that's the form that puts seller on notice of the buyer's requirement to sell the property and creates a contingency protecting buyer. The only time you would choose not to use the 22B in this situation is if seller can answer the question, do you have the ability to purchase seller's property without selling your own? And the answer to that question is yes. And would you choose to do that if your property is not yet sold? And if seller's answer to that question is yes, then set aside your 22B and create the best terms of transaction as you can to facilitate the goals of both buyer and seller. I started out this video series by telling you that Form 22B is the singularly most complicated form in the statewide form system. After this 3-part video series, you likely agree with me. In any event, if you have a question on Form 22B or any other form, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.